Hey guys, tonight we begin with a set of walls so high and so silent that for centuries, nobody really knew what went on inside them. You're standing with me in front of the Forbidden City in Beijing. The year doesn't really matter, take your pick. Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, it's all the same inside these walls, because time here, well, it kind of gets swallowed. Imagine 980 buildings, golden roofs glinting in the sun, red walls stretching out forever. To outsiders, it looked like heaven on earth. But for the women inside, especially the concubines, it was a golden cage. Now, you've heard the word before, concubine. It gets thrown around like a salacious whisper in history books, or worse, like some exotic accessory kings kept around. But I want you to picture it differently. Imagine waking up one day as a teenage girl, plucked from your family, dressed in embroidered silk, and shoved into this palace with one instruction: make the emperor happy, or else. That's your whole job description. Not much of a LinkedIn profile, right? But here's the kicker. You didn't just hang out with the emperor. No. That would be too simple. Your life was a mixture of gossip, deadly politics, and endless waiting. You were competing with hundreds of other women for one man's attention, and if you didn't win, you might never see him. Some concubines spent their entire lives inside these walls without even meeting the emperor once. Imagine that your whole life reduced to staring at golden walls and hoping your number gets called like it's some twisted lottery. And this wasn't some romantic fairy tale. Forget the Disney version where everyone looks happy in silk gowns. Real palace life was more like a reality TV show mixed with a horror movie. There were alliances, betrayals, sabotage. Oh yes, women slipped poison into each other's tea, tore each other's clothes, even set up elaborate pranks to humiliate rivals. Because, in that palace, one little mistake, one wrong word, could bury you for life. But let's slow down. Before we dive into the juicy palace scandals, we need to talk about what a concubine actually did all day. Because trust me, it wasn't just sitting around waiting for royal booty calls. Your morning might begin before sunrise. You'd wake up in some freezing chamber in the back wing of the palace. Don't let the golden roofs fool you. The heating situation was terrible. Servants would help you wash your face with ice-cold water, because, apparently, hot water was reserved for the emperor's main wives and favored concubines. Nice perk, right? And after that, you'd slip into robes that weighed about 20 pounds, layers and layers of embroidered silk. The fashion looked amazing, but was basically an ancient Chinese version of a straitjacket. Then, the waiting games began. Every day you had to be spotless, hair perfectly combed, face powdered, posture straight, because you never knew when the eunuchs might come knocking at your door to announce that the emperor had selected you for the night. Think of it like the weirdest text message in history. Congratulations, you're on tonight's roster. And if that call never came, well, tough luck. But here's the dark truth. Pure survival depended on staying visible, but not too visible. Concubines couldn't just lounge around like bored princesses. No, you had to constantly prove your worth. Learning calligraphy, practicing music, perfecting dance, reciting poetry. Basically, you were a full-time entertainer, academic, and beauty queen rolled into one. Why? Because the emperor might have 100 women, but if you bored him for even 5 minutes, you'd be forgotten forever. And here's the part most people don't realize. Concubines weren't free to walk around or leave whenever they wanted. They were trapped inside the palace for life. Even if the emperor died, you weren't allowed to remarry. In some dynasties, widowed concubines were forced into monasteries, shaved their heads, and lived as nuns. And in darker times, some were buried alive with the emperor so he could have his favorites in the afterlife. Romantic, right? But the daily routine wasn't just about waiting for the emperor. It was about survival of the fittest. Imagine a courtyard filled with women whispering in corners, bribing eunuchs for gossip, spreading rumors about rivals. Every word was a weapon. Every smile could be a trap. And you're stuck in the middle, pretending you're friends with women who would literally kill you if it meant a better seat at the emperor's banquet. And speaking of banquets, food was a huge deal in palace life. Not because you ate like royalty, no. Concubines didn't dine at the emperor's table unless invited. Most days, you ate plain rice, vegetables, maybe some fish if you were lucky. The emperor, meanwhile, feasted on banquets with 100 dishes. And get this, sometimes concubines were forced to watch the emperor eat, just sit there and smile while he stuffed himself. Torture, much. But let's not forget the dark shadow lurking behind every concubine's smile. The ever-present fear of poisoning. Yes, poisoning wasn't just some spy novel fantasy. It was a real everyday threat. Servants tasted your food first, but that didn't always help. One wrong sip of tea, one poisoned hairpin, and you were gone. The palace was basically a deadly chessboard, and the concubines were pawns, sometimes queens if they played their cards right, but usually pawns sacrificed for someone else's win. And yet, despite all this danger and suffocating routine, many concubines dreamed of one thing: giving birth to a son. Because here's the ultimate jackpot. Your son became emperor, your status skyrocketed. You went from a disposable ornament to the Empress Dowager, the most powerful woman in the empire. Overnight, you'd control politics, armies, everything. That's why the competition was so vicious, because in the end, it wasn't just about winning the emperor's attention, it was about securing your future through your children. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, this sounds intense. But what actually went down behind those closed doors when the emperor selected a concubine? Oh, don't worry, we're getting there. And I'll warn you, now it's not as glamorous as TV dramas make it look. Because in the Forbidden City, even intimacy was a matter of ritual, surveillance, and bizarre rules that will absolutely blow your mind. And once you hear what happened, when the emperor summoned a concubine to his chambers, you'll never look at royal life the same way again. So, remember when I told you concubines basically lived like contestants on the deadliest reality TV show? Well, here's the part where things get even weirder. Picture this: you're sitting in your chamber half asleep, when suddenly bam, bam, a eunuch bangs on your door. You jump up, heart racing. This is it, the call you've been waiting for. You're selected. But before you start thinking this is some steamy romance novel, let me tell you, intimacy in the Forbidden City was less about passion and more about paperwork, protocol, and paranoia. First off, let's talk about how the emperor chose. He didn't swipe right on an app. He didn't even stroll through the palace saying, you, and you. Nope. Many emperors literally had their eunuchs bring in silk-covered nameplates of concubines and then toss them onto a table. The emperor would casually flip through them, kind of like he was picking a menu item. When he picked one, the eunuchs would flip the wooden plaque, face up. Congrats, you're the emperor's midnight snack. But here's the bizarre twist. The chosen concubine didn't just walk in. Oh no. She had to be delivered. Literally, eunuchs would carry her to the emperor's chambers, wrapped in a quilt. Because tradition said she wasn't allowed to walk there on her own. Picture it: grown women being lugged around like burritos. And why? Well, partly because the palace had strict nighttime rules. No wandering after dark, but also because it emphasized that she belonged to the emperor. Like, look, she can't even walk without permission. Romantic. Not really. Now once you arrived, you couldn't just hop into bed. Oh no, first came the inspection. Concubines were stripped, bathed, and checked for weapons or poison. The emperor wasn't just worried about love bites, he was worried about assassination. After all, what better way to kill a king than when he's most vulnerable? So the eunuchs had to make sure you weren't hiding a dagger in your sleeve, or a poisoned hairpin in your bun. Talk about killing the mood. Then came the actual encounter. And let me warn youth, this wasn't some candlelit, passionate scene. Everything was regulated down to the minute. Concubines weren't allowed to sleep in the emperor's bed overnight. Nope, once the deed was done, eunuchs wrapped you back in the quilt and carried you out again, like returning an item to the store. You couldn't even coddle afterward. Intimacy was purely about one thing: producing heirs. And speaking of heirs, here's where the paranoia got really spicy. After every encounter, eunuchs recorded the exact date, time, and concubine's name in official ledgers. Why? So that if a child was born 9 months later, there'd be no debate about paternity. Basically, The emperor had the world's first Excel spreadsheet, tracking his extracurriculars. Bureaucracy at its finest. Now, you might be wondering what if the emperor wasn't in the mood. Simple. Concubines still had to show up and act perfect. Imagine being paraded in front of a man who might not even glance at you, but if you frowned, rolled your eyes, or looked bored, game over. You'd be blacklisted faster than a bad Tinder date. Some concubines got sent back to their chambers, never to be summoned again, like a one-star Uber driver who never recovers. But here's the darkest twist. Sometimes being chosen wasn't lucky at all. Because if you got pregnant, congratulations, you just painted a target on your back. Rival concubines would scheme day and night to make sure your baby never saw the light of day. Poisoned tea, tainted food, even hired assassins. It happened more often than you think. The palace was a war zone disguised in silk and jade. And speaking of silk, let's talk fashion for a second, because getting chosen wasn't just about looks, it was about presentation. Concubines wore elaborate makeup, pale faces, delicate eyebrows painted into thin arches, lips tinted just enough to look inviting but not too bold. But here's the kicker. They couldn't dress too extravagantly unless the emperor personally gave them permission. Why? Because showing off too much wealth or beauty could be seen as disrespectful to the emperor's main wife, the empress. Basically, you had to look hot but not too hot. It was the ultimate tightrope walk. Now imagine the psychological pressure. Every night, concubines lay awake wondering, will he pick me? Am I still young enough? Did my rival bribe the eunuch to put her nameplate on top instead of mine? The constant anxiety drove some women to madness. There are records of concubines tearing their own hair out, refusing to eat, or even plotting to run away, though escape from the forbidden city was nearly impossible. But here's a curveball for you. Not every concubine wanted to be chosen. Some dreaded it, because intimacy with the emperor wasn't about love, it was about duty. And if the emperor was cruel, or old, or simply not interested in you as a person, well, too bad. You couldn't say no. Refusing meant punishment, sometimes death. Which means that being lucky enough to be chosen could also mean being trapped in the worst night of your life. Now, let's zoom out for a second. You're probably wondering, what about the emperor himself? Did he actually enjoy all this? Honestly, it depended on the man. Some emperors indulged like rock stars, cycling through dozens of women a week. Others were surprisingly reserved, sticking to a few favorites. But here's the brutal truth. The system wasn't designed for love. It was designed for control. The emperor's bedroom was less about pleasure and more about proving his dominance and ensuring a steady supply of heirs. And the women, they were pawns in a game they didn't sign up for. Their entire future hinged on a single night, or sometimes a single mistake. But here's the part nobody talks about. What if the emperor fell in love with one concubine? Like truly, deeply, heartbreakingly in love. Sounds romantic, right? Wrong, because favoritism was dangerous. If one woman gained too much influence, it could destabilize the entire court. Ministers would panic, the empress would plot revenge, and other concubines would sharpen their knives. In fact, history is full of tragic stories of emperors' favorites meeting mysterious accidents. And trust me, one of the most shocking of these tragedies involves an emperor, his favorite concubine, and a betrayal so twisted it shook the entire dynasty. But that, my friend, is a story I'll reveal in the next section. So, we've seen how concubines got picked, carried like burritos, inspected like groceries, and logged into the emperor's intimacy Excel sheet. But let's be real. The real chaos didn't start in the bedroom. It started the second a concubine got too much attention. Because if there was one person in the palace who hated competition more than anyone, it was the empress. Now, on paper, the empress was supposed to be the supreme wife, the boss of all women in the forbidden city. She had the best clothes, the best rooms, the best banquets. She was like the CEO of the harem. But here's the catch: she still had to share her husband with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of concubines. Imagine planning a romantic dinner, only for your husband to text, "Sorry, I'm booked with Lady Orchid tonight." Brutal. This jealousy wasn't petty, it was dangerous. Empresses had political backing. Their families were powerful clans. with armies and influence. And if a concubine threatened her spotlight, let's just say mysterious accidents tended to happen. Take the tragic story of young Guifei, one of China's most famous beauties. She was the favorite concubine of Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty. He was obsessed with her, ignored politics, skipped court meetings, and spent most of his time writing poetry for her, or eating lychees she loved, which, by the way, had to be couriered across the empire on horseback so they stayed fresh. Talk about simping. But here's the twist. That kind of obsession made the empire weak. Ministers muttered that Yang Guifei's family had too much influence. Generals grumbled that the emperor was distracted, and before long, bomb of rebellion erupted. In the chaos, Emperor Xuanzong's soldiers blamed young Guifei. They said her beauty had cursed the empire. And the solution? They demanded the emperor kill her. Now imagine this scene, Xuanzong heartbroken, forced to strangle the woman he adored with his own hands, or at least order her strangled in front of him. That's how dangerous favoritism could be. One night you're sipping lychee juice with the emperor. The next morning, you're dead because jealous rivals and angry soldiers decided you were too powerful, and Yang Guifei wasn't the only one. Concubines throughout history learned that being too special was like painting a bullseye on your back. Sure, the emperor might shower you with jewels, poetry, and silk gowns. But behind your back, the empress and the other concubines were plotting ways to take you down. And trust me, palace women didn't fight fair. Think poison hidden in face powder. Think accidental falls down marble stairs. Think sudden illnesses that mysteriously happened right after a banquet. The Forbidden City was less palace of harmony and more Game of Thrones, with prettier costumes. But let's not forget the empress wasn't always the villain. Sometimes, she herself was trapped. Picture this. You're the empress, but your husband ignores you for years, preferring younger, prettier concubines. You have the title, the rank, but no affection. And if you don't produce a son, your position becomes fragile. Court officials might even pressure the emperor to demote you. The irony. Even the queen bee wasn't safe. So what did concubines do in this snake pit of silken suspicion? They played politics harder than any general or minister. They bribed eunuchs for gossip, allied with powerful families, and formed cliques to protect each other. But alliances were fragile. Your best friend today might be your poisoner tomorrow. Here's a chilling example. Empress Wu Zishan. She started as a low-ranking concubine, working her way up not by playing nice, but by outsmarting everyone. When she gained the emperor's favor, she made sure rivals disappeared, sometimes literally. There's a story that she strangled her own infant daughter, just to frame the empress at the time, ensuring her downfall. Dark, right, but it worked. Wu Zishan climbed her way to the top, eventually declaring herself the only female emperor in Chinese history. Talk about rewriting the rules of the game. This is the thing nobody tells. You concubines weren't just pretty faces waiting to be chosen. They were survivors, strategists, sometimes outright masterminds, but every step up the ladder came with blood on the silk dot. Now, you might be wondering, what about those concubines who didn't want to play the deadly politics game? What if you just wanted to read poetry, sip tea, and vibe quietly in your courtyard? Sorry, too bad. Even staying quiet could get you killed. Because the moment someone thought you might be gaining the emperor's attention, or even worse, that you were plotting against the empress, you were a target. Silence didn't save you, and here's the kicker. The emperor himself often had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He might think he was just enjoying his concubines, while in reality half of them were engaged in Cold War-style sabotage, and the other half were being poisoned in their sleep. By the time he found out, it was usually too late. But let's zoom back to you. You're a concubine. You've just been chosen for a night. The emperor likes you, and suddenly you're in the spotlight. Sounds glamorous, right? Wrong, because now the empress is staring daggers at you. The other concubines are whispering behind your back, and you start noticing your tea tastes off. Do you drink it? Do you trust your maid? Do you even dare to sleep at night? That's the level of paranoia these women lived with every single day. And yet somehow many thrived. They learned to turn fear into power, suspicion into strategy. They became queens of manipulation, bending not just the emperor, but the entire palace to their will. But of course, there was a price. Always a price. The palace didn't let anyone escape unscarred, and the deeper we go, the darker the secrets get. Because what if I told you? There were concubines who didn't just fight with rumors and poison but with something even more terrifying. Curses, rituals, and ancient magic hidden in the shadows of the Forbidden City. Alright, so we've talked about jealous empresses, poison in teacups, and concubines outplaying each other like it's the deadliest season of Survivor. But here's the thing. Sometimes politics and poison weren't enough. Sometimes, a woman in the Forbidden City had only one weapon left, the supernatural. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, sorcery? In the Emperor's palace? Come on. But you'd be surprised. Ancient China wasn't just about Confucian scholars and strict etiquette. Beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, the palace was crawling with superstition. Every cough, every bad dream, every shadow in the courtyard could be interpreted as an omen. And if you were a concubine desperate to protect yourself, or desperate to eliminate your rival, you'd use whatever power you thought you could get, even if it meant risking your life dabbling in forbidden magic. Picture it, midnight in the palace. The courtyards are empty, the lanterns guttering. You sneak out of your chamber with a servant you trust, well, as much as you can trust anyone. You head to a hidden room in the back of the palace, where the eunuchs store old scrolls and offerings. There, you pull out scraps of yellow talisman paper, ink, maybe even strands of hair stolen from your rival's comb, whispered chants, secret diagrams drawn in ash, and bam, you've just cursed another concubine with infertility, nightmares, or worse, crazy. Maybe, but we have records of this actually happening. In 1542, during the Ming Dynasty, a group of 16 concubines plotted against Emperor Jiao. Why? Because they were sick of his cruelty. Instead of killing him outright, they tried something darker. They gathered in secret, performing Taoist spells to summon spirits that would weaken him. And when that didn't work fast enough, they straight up tried to strangle him in his sleep. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. The emperor survived, and when he woke up, let's just say the punishments were imaginative. The women were executed in brutal fashion, their families disgraced forever. Moral of the story: black magic in the palace wasn't just risky, it was a death sentence if you got caught. But that didn't stop people. Because when you're trapped in a palace with no escape, your rival sharpening her hairpin across the hall, and an emperor who might ignore you for decades, you'll try anything. And for some concubines, that meant lighting incense at forbidden shrines, tying knots in red strings for love charms, or even whispering prayers to gods and ghosts the court officially condemned. Let's pause for a second. Imagine you're one of these women. Day after day, you're powerless. You can't speak freely. You can't leave. You can't control your fate. But then, one night, an old maid tells you about a secret spell, something to make the emperor dream of you, to make him summon your name instead of hers. Wouldn't you at least think about trying it? I mean, what's one candlelit ritual compared to a lifetime of invisibility? But of course, magic had consequences, because sometimes those dream charms worked a little too well. There are stories of emperors becoming obsessed with certain concubines after they used talismans or rituals. An obsession, as we saw with Yang Gaifei, was dangerous. It brought jealousy, rebellion, and death. The Forbidden City, in many ways, was like a haunted house. Every corridor had stories maids swore they saw spirits of dead concubines wandering at night. Eunuchs whispered about cursed rooms where women wasted away after crossing the wrong rival. And whether or not you believe in ghosts, the fear was real enough to shape how people acted. One concubine, known only as Lady Wang in records, was accused of hiding a small shrine in her chamber. On it, figurines pierced with needles, each one representing another concubine. When eunuchs found it, they dragged her before the empress, and the punishment: stripped of rank, exiled to the coldest, darkest wing of the palace. She disappeared. From history after that, probably starved or quietly killed. But here's the twist. The emperor wasn't immune to these superstitions either. Some emperors kept Taoist priests on staff, hoping they'd extend their lives or help them ward off curses. Emperor Jiajengna, same guy nearly strangled by his concubines, was notorious for drinking immortality potions made from toxic ingredients. Spoiler, it didn't work. He died anyway, proving that even the Son of Heaven couldn't outwit poison labeled as magic. Now, imagine being a concubine during all this. You've got rivals plotting, empresses glaring, eunuchs spying, and ghosts supposedly whispering in the halls at night. The paranoia was overwhelming. Some women clutched charms under their robes just to sleep at night. Others whispered mantras under their breath before stepping into the emperor's chambers. To outsiders, it might look ridiculous. But inside those walls, it was survival. And that's the part I want you to really feel. Being a concubine wasn't about glamour. It wasn't about beauty. It was about fear. Fear of rivals. Fear of poison. Fear of being forgotten. And yes, fear of curses that might be lurking just beyond the lantern light. But here's where it gets chilling. What happens when a concubine isn't the victim of a curse, but the source of one? What if the empress herself turned to rituals to eliminate a rival? What if the emperor started seeing his most intimate chambers, not as a sanctuary, but as a haunted trap, where death waited under the silken sheets? Oh, trust me. There's one infamous case that proves exactly that. A concubine so feared, so rumored to dabble in black magic, that even the emperor began to tremble when her name was spoken. And when the truth came out, the entire palace realized that sometimes the deadliest spell of all was not cast with ink and ash, but with a single whispered word. So, up to now we've seen concubines stabbing each other with poisoned eyeliner, and empresses pulling strings like mob bosses. But you're probably wondering, could anyone actually win this game? Could a concubine flip the script and make everyone else, including the emperor, afraid of her? The answer is yes. And her name was whispered through the palace like a ghost story, Consort Xiao. Now, before you go Googling her, let me set the stage. Consort Xiao wasn't the prettiest. She wasn't the most talented. She didn't have a rich family backing her, but what she did have was brains sharper than a dagger, and an understanding of one crucial thing. Fear moves faster than love. Xiao figured out early on that she could never beat the empress or the higher-ranking concubines at their own game. They had the jewels, the titles, the allies. So she decided to fight differently. She leaned into the palace's biggest weakness, superstition. Here's how it started. A rival concubine suddenly fell, ill nightmares, fevers, muttering in her sleep. Nothing unusual in a palace full of stress, right? But Zhao whispered, "It's a curse." She angered the spirits. Boom. Within days, the entire harem was side-eyeing each other, clutching charms, and blaming invisible ghosts for every stomachache. Then another concubine's child was stillborn. Tragic. Yes, but Xiao casually mentioned she'd seen a black bird circling that woman's quarters the night before. And in palace superstition, a black bird was a death omen. Coincidence? Maybe. But guess who everyone blamed for attracting the omen? Not Xiao. Oh no. They blamed the poor grieving mother. Xiao wasn't just spreading gossip. She was weaving a mythos. She built an aura around herself that screamed, "Don't mess with me, or the spirits will get you." And the more bad luck that naturally happened in the palace because, let's face it, in a population of hundreds, stuff goes wrong the stronger her legend became. Soon, even the emperor heard whispers. He laughed it off at first. What? My concubines are scared of ghosts again. Women's nonsense. But then, strange things started happening in his chambers. A favorite vase shattered in the middle of the night. His dreams turned restless. A letter he was reading burst into flames when a candle tipped over. Coincidence? Maybe. But Zhao made sure he heard a quiet rumor. The emperor must have angered the spirits too. Do you see the genius? She never openly threatened anyone. She just planted seeds and let paranoia do the watering. The emperor, who was supposed to be the son of heaven, suddenly couldn't shake the thought that maybe the heavens were watching him. And if they were, who was the one woman rumored to understand the spirits? Yep, Xiao. Now let's be clear. Did Xiao actually practice black magic? History is murky. Some records say she kept a hidden shrine with dolls stuck full of needles. Others claim she merely understood psychology better than anyone else. My personal theory: she didn't need real curses. Fear itself was the curse. Think about it. When everyone believes you can hex them, they treat you differently. Rivals stopped confronting Zhao. Servants obeyed her without hesitation. Eunuchs accidentally dropped other women's names from the emperor's nightly roster, just in case. No one wanted to cross her. But here's where it gets really twisted. Instead of just using this power to protect herself, Zhao used it to climb higher. She whispered to the emperor that certain concubines carried bad luck, that their presence angered the ancestors. And one by one, these women were demoted, banished to cold wings of the palace, or conveniently found themselves accused of treason, all because the emperor, terrified of heaven's wrath, listened to Zhao. Soon, she wasn't just another concubine. She was the emperor's unofficial spiritual advisor. When he had nightmares, he called for her. When he fell ill, she was the one he trusted to burn incense and ward off evil. And when ministers begged him to stop favoring her, he snapped, "Would you dare defy the will of heaven?" Zhao had done the impossible. In a palace where most concubines were pawns, she became a queen. Not through beauty, not through children, but through fear. But you already know what's coming, don't you? Power in the Forbidden City never lasted forever. Zhao's rise made her untouchable, and it made her too dangerous. The empress, who had tolerated Zhao's games as long as they were confined to concubine drama, finally saw her chance. Because one night, the emperor had a terrifying dream. He woke up sweating, shaking, insisting that shadows in his chamber had whispered his name. Who do you think he blamed? At first, no one. But Zhao was there the next morning, offering incense, saying softly, "The spirits are restless, my lord." And just like that, the seed of suspicion turned on her. Ministers, hungry for Zhao's downfall, whispered that maybe she wasn't protecting him from spirits. Maybe she was summoning them. Maybe she was the reason heaven seemed angry. The emperor resisted at first. He trusted Zhao. But paranoia spreads like fire in dry grass. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered, had he given too much power to the wrong woman? And here's the twist that makes my spine crawl. Some accounts say that when Zhao realized her luck was turning, she didn't beg for mercy. She smiled. She told her maids, "If they kill me, the spirits will never forgive them." Can you imagine how that sounded, echoing through the palace? Even in death, she was terrifying. Her execution came quietly, officially for witchcraft. The emperor didn't attend. But rumor has it that the night she died, a storm ripped across Beijing. Lightning struck the palace walls, and the emperor, he never slept peacefully again. So, was Zhao really a witch? Or was she just a master of palace psychology, weaponizing fear better than anyone else? Maybe both. But her story proves something chilling. In the Forbidden City, survival wasn't about beauty, or even children. It was about control, and fear was the sharpest blade of all. But if you think Zhao's story is wild, wait until you hear what came next. Because her downfall didn't kill superstition, supercharged it. Soon, emperors weren't just afraid of witches in their harems. They were afraid of something even worse: their own children. Okay, let's pause for a second. We've talked about poisonous eyeliner, secret stabbings, and witches who scared even emperors. But all of that, child's play. The real battlefield of the harem wasn't makeup boxers or gossip. It was the nursery. Yup, the same place with lullabies, toys, and adorable babies, was ground zero for one of the bloodiest, most terrifying power struggles in Chinese history. Because here's the brutal truth. A concubine's real weapon wasn't her beauty, her wit, or even her supposed black magic. It was her ability to produce an heir. And let me tell you, every emperor had one fear that kept him up at night: which son would betray him first? See, in theory, sons should have been blessings. More sons equals stronger dynasty, right? Wrong. More sons equals more rivals. Every baby born to a concubine wasn't just a cooing little bundle of joy, it was a potential claimant to the throne. And when you've got a palace crawling with ambitious concubines, each one whispering, "My son deserves the crown," you're basically planting landmines in your own family tree. Let me give you an example. The infamous Yongzheng Emperor. This guy didn't just grow up in the shadow of palace paranoia, he lived it. His own father, the Kangxi Emperor, had over 20 sons. 20. That's not a family, that's a political disaster waiting to happen. And what happened? Exactly what you'd expect. The brothers turned on each other like wolves. Concubines schemed, factions formed, servants picked sides, and by the time young Zhen clawed his way to the throne, half his siblings were dead, exiled, or mysteriously erased from the records. Now what does this mean for concubines? Simple. If you had a son, congratulations, you had just entered the deadliest Hunger Games ever invented. Your entire survival land, your sons depended on how well you could keep him alive, protected, and, when necessary, hidden. Imagine this. You're a concubine. You just gave birth to a son. You should be over the moon, right? Wrong. The first thing you think is, how many people want to kill this child before he even learns to walk? And you're not paranoid. History gives us receipts. Concubines' children were poisoned with milk, smothered in their cribs, accidentally dropped by careless servants. Sometimes entire nurseries went up in flames, and behind almost every one of these tragedies was another concubine whispering orders, desperate to clear the path for her son. It's horrifying, but also it makes sense. Because in the Forbidden City, a son wasn't just a child. He was a ticket to survival. If your boy became emperor, you became the Empress Dowager, the most powerful woman in the empire. If he lost, you both died. End of story. Now let me tell you about one of the most infamous mothers in Chinese history, Empress Dowager. Cixi, you've probably heard of her. She basically ruled China from behind the throne for almost 50 years. But how did she start? As a concubine, a nobody. Just another pretty face in the harem of the Shanfeng Emperor. And then bam, she gave birth to a son. Instantly, her stock skyrocketed. Suddenly, she wasn't just another concubine competing for attention. She was the mother of a potential emperor. That one birth changed her fate forever. But here's the thing about Cixi. She wasn't content to just sit back and hope. Her son got lucky. Oh no. She fought tooth and nail to make sure he would be emperor. And when her husband died, she pulled off one of the most cold-blooded power grabs in history. She staged a coup, placed her little boy on the throne, and became his regent. From then on, she ruled from behind the curtain. Ministers would kneel in the throne room and address the emperor. But Cixi was the one sitting behind a silk screen, feeding him every line. But Cixi was just the ultimate example of a trend that had been around for centuries. Mothers using their sons as weapons. Every concubine knew the stakes. If her child thrived, she thrived. If her child faltered, they both died. And that meant these women didn't play nice. Forget baby showers and mommy groups. Palace mothers were out here bribing wet nurses, sabotaging rival kids, and straight up weaponizing bedtime. There are stories of concubines swapping out toys coated in poison, or slipping charms under rival children's pillows to curse them with illness. Paranoid yet? Good. Because here's the part that really gets me. The emperor himself wasn't spared from the paranoia. Imagine being surrounded by 20 sons, and knowing each one was raised by a different mother, who saw you as both their ticket to power and their biggest obstacle. Every time he looked at his own children, he had to wonder, which one of these little faces is going to kill me someday? And he wasn't wrong. History proves he was right. There are countless cases of emperors betrayed by their own offspring. Sons who staged coups. Sons who poisoned their fathers. Sons who allied with ministers to overthrow the throne. And where did those sons learn the art of manipulation? From their mothers. Because make no mistake, concubines weren't just raising babies. They were raising future emperors. Little boys trained from the cradle to scheme, to suspect, to manipulate. Imagine lullabies that doubled as political lessons. Imagine nursery rhymes about loyalty, power, and revenge. That was palace childhood, and the scariest part. For many concubines, the love they had for their sons got twisted by ambition. Did they love their children? Probably, yes. But did they also See them as chess pieces in a deadly game. Absolutely. Love and ambition blurred until you couldn't tell the difference. So picture this, a concubine, rocking her baby to sleep. She kisses his forehead, whispers, "I love you, my son." And in the very next breath, she whispers, "You will kill or be killed." That's the reality of the Forbidden City nursery. And just when you think it couldn't get dark, it does. Because if sons were weapons, what about daughters? They weren't supposed to matter. They couldn't inherit the throne. But sometimes, they were the sharpest daggers of all. Hey, remember how we said sons were weapons? Yeah? Well, daughters were supposed to be useless. Cold as that sounds, that's how the emperors and ministers saw it. Sons were heirs. Daughters were just decorations. Pretty little marriage. Chips to be traded off to keep allies happy. But here's the kicker. Sometimes the pieces everyone ignores turn out to be the deadliest. See, in the Forbidden City, a daughter's worth was measured in two things: how well she could keep secrets, and how well she could be used. And trust me, both skills were weaponized. Imagine being born into this world as a little girl. You don't have a throne waiting for you. You don't have political factions grooming you. No, from the moment you cry, your first cry, the whispers around you are, well, maybe we can marry her off to a general. Or, perhaps a prince in a neighboring kingdom will take her. But inside the harem, daughters were spies before they even learned to walk. Why? Because mothers needed them. If you were a concubine without a son, your daughter was your only way to play the game. She became your eyes and ears, your little shadow in corridors where you couldn't go. Let me paint you a picture. You're 6 years old. While other kids are playing with dolls, you're being told to keep your ears open when the eunuchs talk. You're learning how to pour tea in just the right spot so you can overhear another concubine's secrets. You're memorizing which ladies go where at night, which ones sneak gifts to which officials. And when you go back to your mother's chambers, she leans down and whispers, "Tell me everything you saw." Creepy. Absolutely. But in a palace where rumors meant survival, daughters became the most innocent-looking intelligence agents in history. Nobody suspected them. Nobody punished them. They were just kids, except they weren't. They were weapons, and sometimes daughters were even more dangerous because nobody expected them to matter. Let me give you one example that blows my mind every time. Princess Taiping of the Tang Dynasty now. She wasn't a concubine's daughter. She was the daughter of the Empress Wu Zetian herself. But her story shows what happens when you underestimate palace women. Everyone thought Taiping was just a pampered princess. Wrong. She became one of the most cunning political players in China's history. She orchestrated coups, manipulated alliances, and at one point, she held more power than most generals. Ministers literally bowed to her because she controlled so much behind the scenes. And where did she learn those skills? From her mother. From growing up in a world where women weren't supposed to matter. But every whisper, every sideways glance, every marriage arrangement was a chess move. Now, back to the daughters of concubines. If they didn't become spies, they were pawns. Marriage pawns, to be exact. See, emperors loved to hand out their daughters like party favors. Want to secure loyalty from a powerful family. Marry a princess to their son. Want to keep a general from rebelling? Offer him the emperor's daughter as a bride. Problem solved. Except, for the daughter, it was no solution at all. Imagine being 16, groomed your entire life to smile, bow, and look pretty, and then one morning, boom, congratulations. You're marrying the 50-year-old warlord who smells like horse sweat but will keep the empire stable. Yeah, not exactly a fairy tale. And yet, here's the wild part. Some of these girls managed to turn even this nightmare into an opportunity. They went into these marriages like sleeper agents. Some acted as informants, secretly reporting back to the palace. Others turned their new households into mini empires of their own, manipulating their husbands and sons into becoming loyal to their side. And then, there's the darkest part of all. Sometimes, daughters weren't pawns or spies. They were sacrifices. I don't mean symbolically, I mean literally. When an emperor died, it wasn't unusual for some of his concubines to be buried alive with him, to serve him in the afterlife. Horrific, right? But here's a part that's often brushed over. Sometimes, his daughters were forced into the same fate. Girls, barely teenagers, dragged into tombs they'd never leave. Because the empire believed the emperor needed his family around him in death. Imagine that. Growing up in silk and jewels, only to end up as bones in a sealed tomb before you even reached adulthood. It's the kind of cruel twist that makes you realize just how disposable women were in the eyes of the empire. But because history is messy, not all daughters ended as victims. Some of them played the long game. Some of them built networks of loyalty that lasted for generations. Their sons became emperors, their families rose to prominence, and their names echoed long after the concubines who bore them were forgotten. And here's the chilling irony. While everyone was watching the sons battle for the throne, it was often the daughters who quietly decided who lived and who died. Because every general, every minister, every prince had a wife. And many of those wives were daughters of the harem. Do you see it now? The daughters weren't useless. They were the invisible threads holding the empire together, or tearing it apart. And maybe that's the scariest lesson of all. In a palace, where everyone thought daughters were powerless, they were the ones who learned the art of subtlety, of patience, of influence so quiet it was almost invisible. While the sons raised swords, the daughters raised whispers. And in the Forbidden City, whispers often killed faster than steel. So next time someone tells you that daughters didn't matter in Imperial China, remember this: sometimes the shadows hold sharper knives than the light. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question. How do you keep thousands of concubines, hundreds of scheming princes, and more political drama than Game of Thrones under control? Simple. You spy on them, constantly. And that's exactly what the emperors did. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace, it was a prison wired with invisible chains. The guards weren't just there to stop intruders. They were there to keep the insiders from tearing each other apart. And the eunuchs, oh friend. The eunuchs were the ultimate surveillance system. Let's talk about them. Everyone pictures eunuchs as pitiful figuresmen, who were, altered so they could safely serve in the harem, without any risk of extracurricular activities. But here's the thing. Those guys wielded more power than almost anyone else in the palace. Why? Because they were everywhere. Think about it. Who poured the wine for the concubines? Who carried messages for princes? Who guarded the gates, walked the hallways, and tucked the imperial bedchambers in at night? Eunuchs. Always eunuchs. They saw everything, heard everything, and most importantly, they remembered everything. And because of that, the emperors realized something very clever. Instead of trying to police the concubines themselves, they could just weaponize the eunuchs, turn them into a secret police force. But here's the creepy part. This wasn't done with soldiers, or with obvious guards. No, it was done with whispers. Eunuchs were trained to listen in on conversations, to report anything suspicious. And it wasn't just what was said, but who said it, when they said it, and even how they said it. If a concubine laughed a little too warmly at the wrong eunuch. Noted. If a prince started bribing cooks for extra meals. Logged. If a chambermaid was sneaking love letters into laundry baskets. Oh, you better believe someone wrote that down. But here's where it gets darker. The eunuchs weren't just passive record keepers. They were active manipulators. They fed rumors, played factions against each other, and sometimes deliberately stirred chaos so they could profit from the fallout. Picture this. A concubine whispers something embarrassing about another lady. The eunuch, who overhears it, doesn't just report it to the emperor, no. He casually lets it slip to a rival concubine. Suddenly, there's a feud. Suddenly, gifts are changing hands, bribes are being offered, and who benefits? The eunuch, sitting in the middle, raking in the favors. Basically, eunuchs ran the world's earliest blackmail empire. And you might be wondering, why didn't the emperors stop this? Simple, because emperors needed it. They wanted paranoia. They wanted everyone looking over their shoulders, never sure who to trust. Because a divided harem was a controlled harem. But let's go one layer deeper. The surveillance wasn't just casual gossip, it was institutionalized. There were actual bureaus run entirely by eunuchs that monitored palace behavior. They kept ledgers, reports, and secret archives of who was loyal, who was plotting, and who was just. Inconvenient. Imagine living like that. Every word you spoke, every look you gave, every sigh in the wrong corridor was logged, remembered, and possibly used against you. Talk about claustrophobic. Now, here's where the story really gives me chills. Some emperors got so paranoid. They didn't even trust their concubines or officials. So instead of relying solely on eunuchs, they started building layers of spies. Eunuchs spied on concubines. Eunuchs spied on eunuchs. Concubines sometimes spied on eunuchs. Everyone was spying on everyone. The Forbidden City became less like a palace and more like a spiderweb, with the emperor sitting at the center, twitching every string to see who moved. But wait, it gets worse, because this surveillance system didn't stop at listening. It escalated into tests. Yeah, you heard that right. Some emperors would deliberately test their concubines and eunuchs with fake rumors. They'd tell one eunuch a secret and wait to see if it spread. Or they'd tell a concubine something false about another and see how she reacted. Fail the test, and you might disappear overnight. And when I say disappear, I don't mean transferred to another palace. I mean you were carried out in silence, wrapped in silk, never to be seen again. Now, let me drop a bomb here, because while eunuchs were meant to be loyal watchdogs, some of them became the most terrifying power brokers in China's history. Whole dynasties rose and fell based on the schemes of a handful of eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor. If you couldn't get your message past them, it didn't matter how important you were voiceless. One infamous example: Wei Zhongxian during the Ming Dynasty. He was so powerful that officials literally bowed to him as if he were the emperor himself. He censored documents, executed rivals, and basically ran the empire while the emperor hid in his chambers, making furniture. I'm not even kidding. The emperor was obsessed with carpentry, so the eunuch just took over. So yeah, eunuchs weren't just servants, they were kingmakers, shadow emperors, masters of manipulation. And here's where I want you to imagine yourself again. You're a concubine, walking down those endless red halls. Every flick of your wrist, every sideways glance, every bite you take at a banquet is being observed. Not by one set of eyes, but by 10. And you'll never know which one of those eyes is loyal to you, and which one is sharpening the knife behind your back. That's what life was like in the Forbidden City. Not romance, not luxury. A cage wrapped in paranoia, where every wall had ears and every shadow had teeth. And that, my friend, is where the story twists into something even stranger. Because when you trap thousands of women, thousands of spies, and endless ambition into one palace, you don't just get gossip and plots, you get ghosts. Yes, ghosts. Because all this surveillance, all this paranoia, all this silent execution, it left behind something the Forbidden City could never wash away. And the concubines, more than anyone else, felt it first. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker than gossip, more terrifying than spies, and more unshakable than even the emperor's wrath: ghosts. Now, I know what you're thinking. Come on, are we really going to talk about ghost stories in the middle of China's most political harem? Oh yes. Because here's the truth. When you build a palace on blood, tears and betrayal, you don't just get silk curtains and golden rooftops, you get hauntings and the Forbidden City. It was basically the Disneyland of restless spirits. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're one of the emperor's concubines, locked away in your ornate chamber. By day, it's bustling maids scurrying, eunuchs whispering, rivals pretending to smile at you. But at night, the palace changed. The wind slipped through carved lattice windows, lanterns swayed on their hooks, and long, empty corridors echoed with footsteps when no one should have been there. Concubines weren't stupid. They knew how many accidents really happened behind those vermilion gates. A slip down the stairs, a sudden illness, a disappearance during the night. These weren't random. They were punishments, executions, quiet removals of inconvenient people. And every single woman left behind carried that fear in her bones. But fear doesn't vanish, mutates. It turns into stories. And those stories spread like wildfire. The most famous, the Lady in White. Supposedly, this ghost belonged to a concubine who had fallen out of favor. The emperor stopped visiting her. Her enemies whispered poison in his ear. and one night she was dragged from her quarters and strangled with her own silk sash. After that, concubines swore that when the moon was high, they'd see a pale figure drifting down the palace halls, her sash dragging behind her like a noose. Some even claimed she tapped at their doors, her voice like a whispering draft, "Help me." Now, whether or not you believe in ghosts, think about the psychological warfare here. You're already terrified of making the wrong move during the day, and then at night, you're told spirits are lingering, watching, listening, waiting to drag you into the same fate. That's a double cage: fear of the living and fear of the dead. But that's just one story. Another chilling tale: the crying halls. Servants whispered that at certain hours, you could hear weeping in the southern corridors, long low sobs echoing against the red lacquered walls. The catch: no one was there. When guards went to investigate, the sound vanished. But concubines swore it was the voices of women who had been buried alive beneath the palace foundations. Yes, you heard that right, buried alive. Some historians suggest this was more rumor than reality, but the legend was powerful. It told the women trapped in that palace exactly what their lives were worth: disposable bricks in the emperor's empire. And then there were the shadows. Concubines wrote in secret diaries that they saw flickering silhouettes in their chambers at night. Not lantern light, not servant shapes moving on their own. Imagine lying under silk sheets, unable to scream, because if you did, you'd look weak, or worse, insane. But let's pause for a second, because you and I know how fear works. The more confined you are, the louder the fear gets. These women weren't allowed to leave. They weren't allowed to talk openly. So paranoia built up, and superstition gave it a face. Ghosts weren't just ghosts. They were metaphors. They were trauma wrapped in silk robes. And the eunuchs, oh, they took advantage of it. Some eunuchs deliberately stoked ghost stories to keep concubines obedient. You think you'd sneak out of your chambers at night if everyone told you the lady in white was wandering the halls? Nope, you'd stay put. And that made the eunuch's job much easier. But here's where the story gets extra disturbing. Emperors themselves believed in these hauntings. Some rulers were so paranoid they built entire shrines inside the Forbidden City to pacify restless spirits. Offerings of food, incense, and jade were left out, not just for the gods, but for the women who had died unjustly. Think about the irony. The emperor creates the very system that murders and silences these women. And then he turns around and tries to bribe their ghosts for forgiveness. It's guilt carved into ritual. One emperor, rumored to be terrified of the lady in white, actually banned his concubines from wearing pure white inside the palace. Too dangerous, too eerie. White became the color of death, not purity. So instead of silken white gowns, the women wrapped themselves in jewel tones, while the ghosts supposedly drifted on, untouched. Now, let's make this personal. Picture yourself lying awake in your chamber, knowing spies are watching by day and spirits by night. You clutch your blanket, praying the shadows stay on the other side of the room. Suddenly you hear something. A soft, dragging sound. Almost like fabric, a sash. Your heart hammers in your chest. Do you open your eyes and look? Or do you keep them shut, terrified of what you'll see? That, my friend, was the reality of palace life. Fear stacked on fear until women cracked under the pressure. Some stopped eating. Some went mad. Some went mad. Some simply stopped fighting and let death take them. And this is where the scariest truth hits. Maybe the ghosts weren't real. Maybe they were just the echoes of trauma, kept alive because there was no other outlet. But in a way, doesn't that make them more real? Doesn't that make the lady in white more terrifying, that she was a story birthed from countless broken lives, walking the palace until the dynasty itself crumbled? Either way, the Forbidden City was haunted. By memory, by paranoia, by the whispers of women erased from history. And concubines, trapped inside, lived every night with the question, will I become the next ghost? But you and I aren't stopping here, because if you thought the hauntings were chilling, wait until you hear what concubines themselves started doing about it. They didn't just sit and cry, they created rituals. Secret survival tactics to protect themselves from the spirits, from rivals, and sometimes even from the emperor himself. And trust me, these rituals weren't always pretty. Some of them were downright disturbing. Tonight we begin with something that sounds almost unbelievable. Concubines weren't just pawns waiting to die or ghosts in the making. No, they were players, survivors, magicians of psychology, and survival in the Forbidden City. That wasn't just about pleasing the emperor. It was about rituals. Tiny, obsessive, sometimes disturbing rituals that kept these women sane, or gave them a fragile illusion of control, in a place where control didn't exist. Now, picture yourself again. You're one concubine among hundreds. Everyone's eyes are on you, eunuchs, spies, rivals, even the emperor's officials. You don't get to choose what you eat, what you wear, or who you love. But maybe, just maybe, you can choose the rituals you perform. And those rituals, they might be the only thing standing between you and oblivion. Let's start with the obvious. Protection rituals. Concubines lived in constant fear of poison, fear of betrayal, fear of the lady in white drifting through their chambers at night. So what did they do? They built tiny, invisible fortresses around themselves. Some sprinkled salt in the corners of their rooms to ward off spirits. Others kept jade amulets hidden under their pillows, believing jade could absorb evil energy. One diary fragment even suggests that concubines tied red thread around their ankles before bed, because red in Chinese tradition was the ultimate protector against restless souls. Imagine tiptoeing into your chamber at night, hiding a thread under your silk skirts, and hoping no one noticed, because if they did, they might laugh or worse, report you to the emperor as superstitious and unfit. Then came the food rituals. Oh, this one's wild. Poison was a daily paranoia in the harem. Concubines knew that a rival might slip something into their tea, or a eunuch bribed by an enemy might bring the wrong soup. So some women developed obsessive patterns, always letting a maid taste the food first, always eating from the same bowl. Some even rotated bowls during meals, switching them when no one was looking. So no assassin could be certain which one they'd pick. And here's the kicker. Sometimes the emperor himself was suspicious. There are records of emperors demanding multiple dishes be tested in front of them before they touched a bite. So concubines copied him, turning their paranoia into routine. But rituals weren't only about protection, they were about power. Let me blow your mind here. Concubines weren't just superstitious victims, they weaponized rituals. Some women staged entire performances of devotion, using incense, prayers, and lucky charms not only for themselves, but in public, to show loyalty and purity. Picture this. A concubine kneels in the courtyard at dawn, lighting incense and bowing toward the heavens, whispering prayers for the emperor's health. Everyone sees her. Everyone whispers, "What a virtuous woman. She must be blessed." Suddenly, she's not just a concubine. She's a saintly figure in silk. It was politics disguised as piety. But let's get weirder. Some concubines practiced rituals to manipulate dreams. Yes, you heard that right. They believed that if they burned certain herbs before bed, or placed talismans under their pillows, they could control the emperor's dreams, and appear to him at night as a vision of beauty or virtue. Imagine the stakes of that. You're not just competing with other women during the day, you're competing with them inside the emperor's subconscious. Talk about the ultimate invasion of privacy. Others went a step further. Some records suggest concubines whispered mantras, or sang lullabies under their breath while being with the emperor, hoping the rhythm would plant itself in his mind. A psychological hook, disguised as a bedtime melody. Creepy. Absolutely. Clever. Beyond measure. And then, here's where it gets chilling. There were rituals of silence. In a palace, where one wrong word could end your life, concubines practiced what we might call ritualized restraint. Some vowed never to speak during certain times of the day, believing silence gave them strength. Others developed coded gestures with their personal maids, a whole secret language of subtle hand movements and eyebrow raises. Imagine living in a world where you couldn't trust your voice. So you invented a ritual of silence to survive. But not all rituals were gentle. Some were brutal. For example, fasting. Certain concubines starved themselves intentionally, either. To appear frail and delicate, which emperors sometimes found attractive, or as a kind of spiritual offering to the gods for protection. Some cut their hair or scratched their arms to bleed out bad luck. These weren't just eccentric habits. They were survival strategies, born from desperation. And let's not forget the darkest ritual of all, loyalty unto death. If a concubine's emperor died, there was a horrific expectation in some dynasties that concubines should follow him into death, sometimes through ritual suicide. Women prepared for this by practicing small acts of surrender in life, kneeling until their knees bled, sleeping on hard floors, whispering to themselves each night, "My life is not mine. My life is his." That, my friend, wasn't a ritual. That was brainwashing, woven into ritual clothing now. Here's the part that gets under your skin. Some concubines weren't even sure if the rituals worked. But in a palace of paranoia, rituals gave them a script, a routine, anything they could cling to. And in the silence of their chambers, that little thread of control mattered more than anything. Picture yourself again. You're kneeling by your bed, lighting incense, tying a red thread around your ankle. You're whispering a mantra into the night air. Do you believe it? Maybe, maybe not. But it's either that, or stare into the darkness with nothing. And in the Forbidden City, nothing could drive you mad faster than ghosts, poison, or betrayal. So, these rituals became their armor, their shield, their weapon. And here's the thought that lingers like smoke. How many concubines saved their lives with these rituals? And how many, trapped in superstition, simply delayed the inevitable? Because while some women clung to prayer and thread, others turned to something even more dangerous: sciences, whispers in the dark, secret friendships, rivalries, betrayals, and, if you thought rituals were eerie, wait until you see what concubines were willing to do when survival meant cutting deals in the shadows. Tonight we begin with something even more dangerous than poison in a cup of tea. Whispered promises in the dark. Because here's the truth. Rituals were the concubine's private shield. Alliances were their public sword. You couldn't survive the Forbidden City alone. Not with hundreds of women competing for one man's fleeting attention. Not with spies listening to every word. Not with rumors more lethal than steel. To survive, you had to choose your friends as carefully as you chose your enemies. So imagine yourself, again, as a concubine. You wake up in silk sheets that feel more like a trap than a luxury. The walls of your chamber whisper. Everyone is plotting. Everyone wants to climb higher. Do you align yourself with the gentle concubine who smiles at you in the gardens? Or do you secretly offer gifts to the powerful head eunuch, the man who controls, who eats with the emperor that night? One wrong alliance, and you're finished. Let's start with the basics. Concubines didn't just ally with other concubines. They built entire networks. Eunuchs were the gatekeepers, the emperor's food tasters, messengers, and chamber guards. Winning over a eunuch could mean the difference between being randomly chosen to warm the emperor's bed, or being left to rot unseen in your chamber. Some women bribed eunuchs with silk, jewelry, even small parcels of land for their families outside the palace. Others offered something even more precious. Information. Yes, concubines were information dealers. They slipped secrets like daggers into the right hands. The emperor's first wife is sick again. That rival concubine hasn't been eating. Maybe she's cursed. Information was currency, and the eunuchs, they cashed it like kings. But alliances inside the concubine's own ranks. Oh, those were the deadliest. Some concubines formed what were called sisters. A handful of women would agree to protect one another, share gifts, cover each other's mistakes, and defend one another from rumors. Sounds sweet, right? But these sisterhoods were often as fragile as porcelain. One betrayal, and the whole pact shattered into shards. Let me tell you a story. During the Ming Dynasty, there was a concubine named Lady Wang. She formed a tight alliance with 2 other women, sharing food, clothing, and even strategies for winning the emperor's attention. They were inseparable when one day Lady Wang was caught sneaking a letter to her family. One of her sisters exposed her. Why? Because by betraying Lady Wang, that woman earned a higher rank in the harem. The message, in the Forbidden city, sisterhood, was only as strong as ambition allowed. And here's the twist. Sometimes alliances weren't even about survival. They were about sabotage. A group of women might band together to destroy one rival who was rising too quickly. They'd whisper in the emperor's ear, feed him stories, orchestrate accidents in the palace gardens. Imagine walking into your chamber and finding your cosmetics swapped with poisoned powder, or your favorite robe mysteriously set ablaze by a fallen candle. That wasn't clumsiness. That was conspiracy now. Let's not forget the role of the empress. She was the queen bee in this hive of intrigue. Every concubine knew. Align yourself with the empress, and you gained protection. Defy her, and you vanished. But the empress herself was often just as trapped sometimes. She had to ally with concubines just to keep her throne secure. It was a snake pit, and everyone was biting everyone else. Picture the paranoia of it. You're sitting at a banquet, the emperor laughing as musicians play. You sip your tea, the woman next to you smiles, pours you more. Is she your friend, or did she just seal your fate? And here's the darkly funny part. Sometimes concubines pretended to ally with rivals just to study their weaknesses. They'd play the role of best friend, gathering secrets like a spider spinning its web, only to use them later. Oh, did you know Lady John cries every night? Must be a sign she's unstable. Boom, reputation destroyed. But what about love? Did alliances ever turn into something more human, actual affection? Maybe even forbidden romance? Historians whisper yes. Some concubines leaned on one another in ways that blurred the line between friendship and intimacy. Others built quiet, genuine bonds with eunuchs, who were technically safe companions. But even those softer alliances were dangerous. If discovered, they could be twisted into charges of treason or immorality. Love, in the Forbidden City, was often the sharpest betrayal of all. And then there were alliances with the emperor himself. Here's the sick irony. Being chosen for his bed didn't always mean you were safe. If he favored you too much, the others marked you. If he ignored you, you faded into nothing. So some concubines learned to play a strange game. They shared power with the emperor by whispering suggestions, feeding him gossip, nudging him toward decisions that benefited their allies. Subtle manipulation became its own form of alliance, one that could shift the empire itself. Now, let's pause and imagine again. You're kneeling in your chamber, writing a letter to the eunuch who delivers the emperor's nightclothes. You promise him silver if he whispers your name tonight. Across the courtyard, your sister in silk is whispering your secrets to the empress. And overhead, the palace lanterns flicker, as if mocking you. You're not playing a game of alliances. You're walking through a minefield of betrayals. Here's the part that really makes your skin crawl. No one ever truly knew who their friends were. Every smile might be a mask. Every gift might be poisoned. Every whispered promise might be the last rope before you hang. And yet concubines played this game because they had no choice. Survival wasn't about beauty or charm alone. It was about strategy. About knowing when to kneel and when to strike. About placing your trust in shadows and hoping they didn't swallow you whole. So let me leave you with this image. Two concubines, side by side, in the emperor's gardens. They laugh together, share tea, trade compliments. But behind those smiles, both are calculating. One is planning to ruin the other before the moon is full. And neither of them will see the knife coming, because alliances in the Forbidden City weren't built on love. They were built on fear. And fear, my friend, has no loyalty. All right, my friend, picture this. The Forbidden City at dawn. 1,000 red tiles glittering with morning dew. Drums echoing through courtyards big enough to swallow your entire hometown. The air smells of incense and freshly polished lacquer. Wood. Eunuchs run in every direction like frantic ants. Robes swishing. Voices clipped. Because today is not just another day of palace gossip. Today the entire empire is watching. Ceremonies. They weren't just rituals, they were weapons. For concubines, ceremonies were the rare occasions where you weren't hidden behind silk screens or waiting alone in your chamber. Suddenly, you were on display, like exotic birds in a cage, paraded before the emperor, the empress, and sometimes the eyes of foreign dignitaries. Every bow, Every flick of your sleeve, every shimmer of your hairpin was a message. I belong here. I am valuable. Do not forget me. But here's the catch. Ceremonies weren't about individuality. They were about hierarchy. And hierarchy in the Forbidden City was sharper than any blade. Imagine the lineup. At the top sat the Empress, in a throne slightly lower than the Emperor's but commanding all eyes. Behind her stood the imperial noble consort, then the noble consorts, pure consorts, concubines, and finally, the lesser-ranked women who barely counted. Every rank was marked, not just by titles, but by clothing. The Empress shimmered in robes, embroidered with dragons, while a fourth-rank concubine might only get butterflies. One wrong stitch, one bead out of place, and you could be accused of trying to usurp someone else's status. Now here's where it gets terrifying. Ceremonies were public. That meant mistakes couldn't be hidden. If you stumbled during the kowtow, if your voice cracked while reciting blessings, if your sleeve slipped to reveal too much arm, it was noted. By the Empress, by the eunuchs, by rivals who smiled politely while sharpening their memories into weapons. One tiny slip, and by nightfall the whispers would start. Did you see her tremble? Clearly not fit to serve the Son of Heaven. Let me give you a real example. During the Qing dynasty, a concubine named Consort Qi once wore a hair ornament that glittered too brightly during a New Year's ceremony. It caught the Emperor's eye. Unfortunately, it also caught the Empress's fury. The very next day, Consort Qi's chamber was accidentally set on fire. She survived, but her favor was gone. A single jewel, too flashy, became her downfall. But ceremonies weren't just about danger, they were also about opportunity. For many concubines, it was the only time to get close enough to the Emperor to be noticed. During grand festivals, like the Lantern Festival or the Emperor's birthday, women could catch his eye with a graceful bow, a perfectly timed smile, or a whispered blessing that lingered in his ears. Think of it like the world's deadliest beauty pageant, and oh, the performances, music, dance, poetry, recitations. These weren't hobbies, they were survival tactics. Concubines spent weeks rehearsing for ceremonies, perfecting songs in delicate voices, memorizing verses of ancient poetry, and practicing dances where every fingertip had to move in sync with celestial rhythms. Fail, and you'd be humiliated. Excel, and you might just rise. Some concubines became legends for their performances. Lady Zhao of the Han Dynasty, for instance, stunned the court with her flawless recitation of a 1,000-line poem during the Madatum festival. That night, she was invited to the Emperor's chambers and, within a year, she was one of the most powerful women in the palace. Talent wasn't just admired, it was a weaponized charm. But don't be fooled. Even ceremonies of peace had a dark underbelly. Think of the Emperor's birthday celebrations. Concubines would present gifts, silks, jade carvings, exotic teas. But gifting was a game of politics. Too lavish, and you looked like you were overstepping the Empress. Too humble, and you risked looking unworthy. And sometimes, gifts were sabotaged. Imagine presenting a perfect bolt of silk, only to have a rival slip in a hidden flaw so the Emperor thought you insulted him. Every smile was loaded, every gesture could be twisted. And then, there were the big stage ceremonies, where not just the inner palace but the outer court, officials, and even foreign envoys were present. Concubines might not always sit in the spotlight, but they were part of the Emperor's image. Their elegance reflected his glory. If a concubine looked sloppy, it made him look weak. If they dazzled, his empire glittered too, which meant that sometimes, emperors themselves pushed certain concubines to perform not out of love, but because their beauty made him look untouchable. But let's not forget, ceremonies weren't only festivals, they included grim rituals. Too, when an empress dowager died, the entire harem had to perform mourning rites. Women wore sackcloth, fasted, and wailed in choreographed grief. Some fainted from exhaustion, others pretended to faint, just to look more devoted. Mourning became its own performance of loyalty. Miss a tear, and you might be accused of disrespect. Cry too hard, and rivals whispered you were faking it. You couldn't win unless you mastered the art of controlled sorrow. Now imagine the psychological toll. Every public event was a test. Concubines had to project perfection while their stomachs churned with anxiety. A smile that lasted too long could be your doom. A step too short might signal weakness. Behind the grandeur of red lanterns and booming drums, every woman was silently calculating her survival. And here's where it gets sinister. Sometimes, ceremonies themselves were used as traps. A concubine might be asked to perform a dance she hadn't rehearsed, setting her up to fail. Or she might be given an outfit by mistake that violated the dress code, ensuring public humiliation. These weren't accidents, they were assassinations of reputation. Let me leave you with this image: the emperor's birthday banquet. Hundreds of candles flicker, casting golden light over the hall. The empress sits rigid, her jeweled headdress heavier than steel. Concubines kneel in perfect rows, their silks rustling like waves. Music swells, and one by one, the women step forward to bow, offer blessings, perform, smiles everywhere. But underneath the smiles, pure terror. Each woman knows, tonight, one of us will rise, another will fall. And the emperor, he laughs, he drinks, he watches, but he doesn't see the fear behind the painted faces, because ceremonies weren't just for celebration. They were arenas of silent war. All right, let's be honest. Palace's life wasn't all silk robes and ceremonial bows. Imagine being locked inside the Forbidden City, day after day, month after month. You can't just say, "Hey girls, let's go downtown for hot pot and karaoke." Nope. Your whole world was a maze of courtyards, red walls, and watchful eyes. Boredom could gnaw at you worse than any rival. And boredom, as history teaches us, can make people very creative. Or very dangerous. So what did concubines do behind those closed, lacquered doors when the emperor wasn't calling? They invented their own entertainment secret games, playful diversions, and sometimes risky amusements that could cost them everything if discovered. Let's start with the most innocent: board games. Concubines loved to play Go Wakey and Liubo, ancient games of strategy and chance. Picture two women hunched over a board, the faint glow of oil lamps casting shadows across their pale faces. A eunuch serves tea silently in the corner while the two players wage psychological war with black and white stones. It wasn't just fun, it was practice. In a world where survival depended on strategy, playing Go was like running military drills for the mind. Every captured stone was a rehearsal for outmaneuvering rivals. And then there was poetry. Writing verses wasn't just a pastime, it was an entire underground competition. Concubines would slip folded sheets of poetry under each other's doors, sometimes praising the emperor, sometimes mocking rivals with veiled metaphors. Imagine getting a poem that looks innocent but secretly compares you to a wilted chrysanthemum. Ouch. Poetry battles could get savage. And of course, the emperor loved poetry, so the best verses were often accidentally left where he might find them. Subtle self-promotion at its finest. Music was another outlet. Many concubines were trained in instruments like the pipalute or the guqin zither. They would gather in private chambers and perform for each other. But these weren't casual jam sessions. Sometimes, the music carried hidden messages, melancholy tunes, hinting at loneliness, or passionate songs that spread rumors about who was in favor. Music was emotional venting disguised as art. But let's get to the spicier part. Gambling. Yep, palace women gambled. Dice games, card games, even betting on cricket fights. That's right. Cricket fighting was a huge thing. Concubines kept tiny cages of crickets, feeding them carefully to make them strong. On quiet nights, they would gather to pit their insects against each other. Imagine these elegant women, dripping in silk, huddled around a small wooden cage, squealing in delight or despair as their champion cricket battled. It sounds absurd, but for them, it was thrilling. Bets were made not always with money, but with favors. Lose this round, and you owe me a new hairpin. Innocent enough, until debts turned into grudges. Some games, though, tiptoed into the forbidden. Whispered accounts tell of truths or dare-style challenges where concubines would dare each other to steal an item from a rival's chamber, or sneak into restricted courtyards. Dangerous. Absolutely. But when your daily life is suffocating under etiquette, the risk itself becomes intoxicating. Then there were story circles. Women would gather and tell tales, ghost stories, legends, gossip about officials. But some of these stories weren't just for fun. They were sharp-edged tools. A concubine might spin a fictional story about a jealous empress poisoning her rivals. But everyone listening knew exactly who she was really talking about. Storytelling became coded warfare. And don't think for a second they didn't prank each other. There are records of concubines putting itching powder in each other's robes, hiding hairpins, or tricking eunuchs into delivering fake notes that led to embarrassing misunderstandings. Harmless, maybe. But in a place where reputation was everything, a small prank could spiral into serious consequences. But perhaps the most dangerous entertainment of all, romantic games. Let's not pretend that every concubine spent her life desperately waiting for the emperor's attention. He might only summon a woman once or twice in her lifetime. Meanwhile, she was young, beautiful, and very much alive. Some concubines, especially those out of favor, sought companionship elsewhere, sometimes with eunuchs, sometimes even with guards. It was a deadly game. Getting caught meant execution. Yet, the risk only added to the thrill. Behind the painted faces and rigid bows, there were still human hearts beating fast in the dark. One Ming Dynasty rumor tells of a concubine who disguised her forbidden romance as a game of poetry. She and a palace guard exchanged verses through hollow bamboo pipes hidden in the garden. For months, their game went undetected. But of course, secrets in the Forbidden City never stay hidden for long. One night, their notes were discovered. The guard was executed. The concubine vanished from the records. Was she imprisoned, poisoned, erased? We'll never know. But her story was whispered for generations as a warning. Some games weren't meant to be played. And here's the fascinating part: many of these secret amusements weren't just about killing time. They were coping mechanisms. The palace was suffocating. You were cut off from family, forbidden to leave, constantly watched. Games, stories, even cricket fights gave concubines a taste of freedom within gilded walls. They built little worlds of laughter and rebellion in a place designed to crush individuality. But remember, everything inside the Forbidden City had layers. Even the most innocent entertainment could hide daggers. A poetry circle might look like fun, but it was also a chance to size up your rival's wit. A board game wasn't just about stones, it was about practicing patience, deception, control. Every pastime doubled as training for the bigger game. Survival. So the next time you picture palace, women reclining on cushions, idly strumming lutes, imagine the tension underneath. A smile across the board game wasn't just friendliness. It was calculation. A shared joke wasn't just laughter. It was testing loyalty. Even fun was war, dressed in silk. Hey, let's be real. Survival in the Forbidden City wasn't about beauty alone. You could be the most stunning concubine alive. But if you didn't understand the hidden economy of palace life, you might as well have been invisible. Because, inside those vermilion walls, power wasn't just political, it was transactional. Here's the secret they don't tell you in history class. The harem ran on bribes, gifts, and favors. Think of it like an underground marketplace. But instead of money changing hands openly, it was silks, jewels, rare teas, and whispered promises moving in circles of influence. Let's start with the most obvious currency: gifts to the emperor. Now, technically, a concubine wasn't supposed to shower the emperor with presents. She was already his possession, but rules in the palace were like delicate porcelain. Everyone pretended not to see when they cracked. If you wanted attention, you had to stand out. That meant slipping him something unique. Some concubines sent hand-embroidered robes that subtly carried auspicious symbols, dragons, cranes, or pomegranates hinting at fertility. Others arranged elaborate feasts, hoping the emperor would drop by chance and be impressed. A few went further. Records tell of one Qing dynasty concubine who gifted the emperor a perfectly trained songbird that sang only at dusk. Harmless, right? Wrong. The empress found out, accused her of using witchcraft, and the poor girl ended up demoted. In the palace, even a bird could be political dynamite. But it wasn't just about the emperor. The real economy hummed in the shadows, bribing eunuchs. Never forget, tunics were the gatekeepers of the palace. They controlled who got access to the emperor, which messages reached him, and even how concubines' reputations were spread. If a concubine wanted her name whispered in the right ear, she needed eunuch allies. What did eunuchs want? Money, of course, but also status trinkets, fine fabrics, medicine, good food. A concubine who slipped a eunuch a pouch of silver might suddenly find herself summoned to the emperor's quarters more often. Another who gifted a rare herbal tonic might earn an early warning about palace investigations. It wasn't loyalty, it was business. And if you couldn't pay, you were out of luck. Now, let's talk about the most delicate exchanges. Bribing other concubines. Shocking, right? But it happened. If you couldn't beat a rival, sometimes it was smarter to buy her off. Oh, you're interested in catching the emperor's eye this week? Well, here's a jade bracelet. How about you step back, just this once? It wasn't friendship, it was negotiation with lipstick. And then there were the festivals. Festivals. Inside the palace were not just celebrations. They were prime opportunities to flaunt wealth and alliances. Concubines would compete with lavish gifts for the emperor, but also for each other. Imagine a grand feast where one concubine presents a rare imported fruit, say lychees delivered at lightning speed from the southern provinces. Everyone gasps, the emperor smiles, and suddenly her status soars. But in the back of the hall, another concubine seethes. She had spent weeks preparing her silk lanterns, and now she's overshadowed. That envy, that's the beginning of whispered plots. And here's where it gets even darker. Sometimes, gifts were traps. Oh yes, an innocent box of sweets could hide poison. A new robe embroidered with phoenixes might have been laced with irritants that caused rashes. Not enough to kill, but enough to make sure your rival didn't look so flawless at the next banquet. Every present came with suspicion. Accepting a gift was like playing Russian roulette with jade hairpins. But the real engine of the harem economy wasn't just material. It was information. Secrets were the highest form of currency. Knowing which eunuch had been reprimanded, which minister had fallen from favor, or which concubine had secretly angered the empress, that was worth more than gold. Information was traded like poker chips. A concubine might whisper, "I heard the emperor plans to tour the southern gardens tomorrow," in exchange for a rival's confession about who supplied her rare perfumes. Information could build alliances, or destroy them. Think about it, like this. Every silk screen, every folded letter, every gift of fruit or jewelry was part of a massive, invisible stock exchange. And the stakes: life, death, obscurity, or eternal glory. But wait, it gets even crazier. The servants and maids were also part of this underground market. Concubines relied on their maids to deliver secret notes, smuggle gifts, and spread rumors. A loyal maid was priceless, but loyalty could be bought. Rival concubines would often try to bribe each other's maids with promises of freedom or silver. Imagine the paranoia. Every time your maid brought you tea, you'd wonder, whose side is she really on? And remember those festivals we talked about? They weren't just displays of wealth. They were also opportunities for alliances. Concubines would band together, pooling resources to outshine their rivals. One group might plan a joint performance, dazzling the emperor with their harmony. Another might co-host a feast. But alliances in the palace were like glass, fragile, beautiful, and guaranteed to shatter eventually. The most famous example: the rivalry between Empress Wu Zixin's court women. During her rise, women in her circle exchanged gifts, power, and secrets like chess moves. But when Wu seized power fully, many of those allies found themselves executed or exiled. In the palace, debts were remembered long after gifts were forgotten. So when you picture concubines in gilded halls, don't just see delicate flowers sipping tea. See sharp-eyed players in a high-stakes economy, trading silks for influence, gossip for protection, jade for survival. It wasn't love that ruled the palace, it was commerce disguised as affection. And here's the cruelest part. None of this was written into official records. You'll read dynastic chronicles about wars, taxes, treaties, but the invisible economy of the harem. It lived and died in whispers. Yet it shaped who rose to power and who vanished without a trace. Alright, let's drop the glamour for a moment. Because if you thought concubines spent their days in silks and music, sipping tea like porcelain dolls, you're only seeing half the story. The other half is uglier sickness, fear, and death, hiding in every corner of the palace. Imagine it. You're locked in the Forbidden City, surrounded by hundreds of women, thousands of servants, and a suffocating atmosphere of paranoia. Fresh air, limited. Freedom, non-existent. Privacy, forget. This wasn't just stressful, it was lethal. First, let's talk about the most obvious killer, disease. You see, the palace was a breeding ground for it. The architecture itself, massive stone courtyards, endless halls, narrow air stagnant. In the humid summers of Beijing, mosquitoes thrived. Malaria was a recurring nightmare. Winter brought freezing winds and colds that spread like wildfire. And here's the catch. Concubines couldn't just call for the best doctors. Whenever they sneezed, treatment depended on rank. If you were favored by the emperor, congratulations. Imperial physicians would swarm around you with rare herbs, exotic tonics, and acupuncture needles of gold. If you weren't, you might be left with second-rate care, or worse, ignored until it was too late. Imagine lying in your chamber with a fever while hearing rumors that your rival across the courtyard was drinking imported ginseng soup every morning. The resentment must have been like poison itself. And let's not forget the deadliest curse of all, childbirth. Concubines were expected to bear sons. It was their ultimate duty. But the palace was notorious for high maternal mortality. Hygiene standards were primitive, and midwives often operated under enormous pressure. A single infection could end both the concubine and her child. Even when women survived childbirth, complications lingered, chronic weakness, bleeding, or infertility. And infertility. That was basically a death sentence for your relevance. Now, pile onto this, the constant superstitions. The Forbidden City may have been the epicenter of Chinese power, but it was also drowning in ritual and omens. Concubines lived in terror of bad luck, a broken comb, a cursed sign, a dream about blood, an omen of death. Whisper networks thrived. On this paranoia, if a rival wanted to undermine you, all she had to do was spread rumors. She dreamed of crows last night hit, means the ancestors are displeased. Suddenly, you're tainted. Some concubines turned to charms for protection. Amulets hidden in sleeves. Talismans burned and mixed into tea. Secret prayers whispered at night to Buddha, Guanyan, or even Taoist spirits. But charms weren't just for protection, they were weapons too. One concubine might slip a cursed talisman under another's pillow, knowing that fear alone could cause insomnia, stress, and decline. A sick woman didn't need poison to weaken her own mind, could eat her alive. Speaking of the mind, let's not underestimate psychological illness. Modern historians believe many concubines suffered from anxiety, depression, and paranoia. How could they not? Imagine a life where your worth depended on whether an emperor, who might not even remember your name, decided to glance your way. One wrong word could mean demotion, banishment, or worse. That level of stress is enough to break anyone. And then came the silent killers. Poison and slow-acting toxins. Unlike the dramatic tales you see in movies, poison in the palace was often subtle. Arsenic mixed into face powders, mercury hidden in tonics. Lead-laced cosmetics. Concubines were literally poisoned by the very beauty products they used to stay desirable. Pale skin, rosy cheeks, darkened brows, all achieved with chemicals that corroded their insides over time. You wanted to look flawless. It might kill you. But here's the kicker. Sometimes, no one needed to poison you at all. The palace itself was toxic. The paint on the walls, the glaze on ceramics, even the water in the wells carried heavy metals and bacteria. A concubine could fall ill just by living there long enough. The Forbidden City wasn't just gold, it was a gilded coffin. Let's pause here and think about the paranoia this created. Every time a concubine fell ill, everyone whispered, was it natural, or was it sabotage? Maybe she simply caught a fever. Or maybe her rival bribed her maid. The lines blurred so much that trust dissolved completely. Even friendship was poisoned. And then there were the official palace purges. Whenever an emperor died, or suspicion of witchcraft arose, concubines were the first to be investigated. Sickness was often blamed on women's yin energy being imbalanced, or worse, on secret rituals gone wrong. A simple fever could lead to accusations of sorcery, and in the palace, accusations could be more deadly than any disease. Take the case of concubine Rong of the Ming dynasty. She fell ill with a wasting sickness. Instead of compassion, rumors spread that she had cursed another concubine's pregnancy. Doctors were ordered to investigate her chambers. They found talismans, probably harmless charms, for health but declared them evidence of black magic. Rong was executed. Her sickness became her death warrant. This was the tragic irony of palace life. Illness was everywhere. But instead of sympathy, it made you vulnerable. Weakness invited suspicion, and suspicion killed. So what did concubines do to protect themselves? They doubled down on routines. Some obsessed over cleanliness, bathing multiple times a day, burning incense to purify the air, avoiding certain foods considered unlucky. Others built secret networks with palace physicians, bribing them for early treatments, and some simply retreated into fatalism, leaving that if sickness came, it was fate, the will of heaven. But let's be honest, no matter what they did, their bodies were battlefields. Every sip of tea, every cosmetic, every breath of palace. Air was a gamble. Concubines didn't just compete with each other for love. They competed with death itself, every single day. Hey, remember how in the last section sickness was everywhere, and paranoia was the air everyone breathed? Well, here's the twist. The palace didn't just fight death with medicine, it fought it with ritual. And oh boy, you'd better believe. Those rituals were exhausting, terrifying, and strangely theatrical. Let me put you there. It's dawn in the Forbidden City. You're a concubine, half asleep. Your hair pinned back in some ridiculously complicated braid, and already someone is knocking at your chamber door. Get up. Today's ceremony cannot wait. There's no such thing as sleeping in when you're an imperial concubine. Every day began with ritual, and those rituals were both spiritual insurance and political theater. First up, morning offerings. The emperor's palace wasn't just a home, it was a sacred microcosm of the universe. Everything revolved around heaven's mandate. So, concubines were expected to pray at altars, burn incense, and bow to ancestral tablets. You had to look pious, calm, and radiant, even if you secretly wanted to chuck that incense stick at someone's face. Because remember, servants were watching, eunuchs were reporting, and the emperor's spies had ears everywhere. If you yawned during prayers, someone would whisper, "She doesn't respect the ancestors." That tiny rumor could ruin you. And speaking of ancestors, did you know concubines were sometimes roped into ritual fasting? Yeah, imagine starving yourself for the emperor's dead relatives. If an auspicious day demanded purification, women could be required to skip certain meals or abstain from rich foods. The irony: you're locked in a palace with feasts fit for gods, and you're stuck nibbling bland rice porridge because heaven said so. But it wasn't all incense and fasting. Concubines also played starring roles in seasonal festivals. Picture it: the Lantern Festival, the Mid-Autumn Festival, New Year's rituals. These weren't just holidays, they were giant, glittering stages where concubines were props in the emperor's show of cosmic harmony. Every outfit was chosen down to the thread color, every movement rehearsed. Concubines lined up like living ornaments, bowing in sync, reciting prayers in unison. Mess up the choreography, humiliating. Do it too perfectly. Risky too, because some other concubine might accuse you of trying to outshine her. And then there were the sacrificial ceremonies. Imagine being told to wake up at 3 a.m., to walk barefoot on cold stone, carrying trays of offerings, silk, jade, even animals to temples inside the palace. The emperor might not even be there, but his concubines had to show devotion in his name. Think about the absurdity. You're offering sacrifices to heaven and earth, when in reality, you're just a pawn in a political chess game. But you smile, you bow, you play the role. Now, Here's where it gets juicy. Concubines weaponized these rituals. Yep, survival wasn't just about looking pretty. It was about playing the long game in the theater of ritual. For example, ritual seating, where you sat and ceremonies revealed your rank. High-ranked concubines were closer to the emperor. Low-ranked ones were practically hidden behind pillars. Imagine the gossip this caused. Did you see Lady Zheng's seat was 2 cushions farther than usual? Must mean she's slipping. Or the opposite. Lady Li sat 3 rows closer. Clearly she's rising. A single cushion could change the rumor mill overnight. Then came ritual gifts. Concubines were sometimes ordered to present offerings to the emperor, rare fabrics, jewels, even handmade embroidery. Now, this was a double-edged sword. Too extravagant, and you risked being called arrogant. Too simple, and you looked ungrateful. The trick: subtle personalization. A concubine might stitch a discreet motif into her embroidery, something meaningful to the emperor, like his favorite flower or a star constellation. Suddenly, she wasn't just another face in the crowd, she was the one who understood him. Rituals became weapons of seduction. And don't forget, ritual performances. Oh yes, some ceremonies featured music, dance, or poetry recitals performed by concubines. On the surface, this was harmless entertainment, but beneath it, a battlefield. That dance wasn't just a dance. It was a chance to catch the emperor's eye. That poem wasn't just a poem. It was a veiled confession of loyalty. And if you messed up, your rival would smile sweetly and whisper to a eunuch, "Such a pity her voice was off today. Perhaps she's unwell." Bam, rumor planted. But here's the kicker. Even daily routines were ritualized: eating, sleeping, bathing, all timed and supervised. Some meals were preceded by blessings, certain foods forbidden on unlucky days, certain garments banned during inauspicious months. It sounds obsessive, but for concubines, mastering these rules was survival. Break a taboo, you're careless. Follow them flawlessly, you're disciplined and worthy. Rituals weren't just religion, they were tests. And oh, the tests never stopped. Want a particularly chilling example? The emperor's nightly ritual of choosing. Sometimes a eunuch would present him with wooden plaques, each carved with a concubine's name. He'd flip through them like a man picking a restaurant menu. Once chosen, the plaque was delivered to her chamber. That moment was a ritual too, because how you greeted him, how you bowed, how you prepared the room, all followed strict codes. Imagine trembling in your silk robe, knowing one wrong gesture could mean no second chance. It's exhausting just thinking about it. But for concubines, rituals weren't just chores, they were survival scripts. Master them, and you bought yourself another day, another chance to be noticed. Fail, and you were invisible. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Doesn't this sound like theater? Every gesture rehearsed, every prop symbolic, every scene performed for an audience of one, the emperor. Concubines weren't just women. They were actresses locked in the longest-running play in history. And the stakes? Not applause, survival. But what's the hidden danger of living in ritual 24/7? You start to lose yourself. Imagine bowing so often you forget how to stand tall. Imagine reciting so many blessings, you don't know what your own voice sounds like anymore. Rituals gave concubines a script, but they stole their spontaneity, their freedom, their selves. If you thought incense smoke and ceremonial bowing was exhausting, wait until you see the concubine's other battlefield, performance. Because in the Forbidden City, being beautiful wasn't enough. You had to dazzle, you had to entertain, you had to turn music, poetry, and dance into weapons. Let's set the scene. Picture the emperor at dinner, seated at a lacquered table, piled with delicacies, duck glazed with honey, steamed dumplings glowing like pearls. Around him, a semicircle of women, each one dressed in silks that shimmer like firelight. The air hums with expectation. Because tonight, someone has to perform. And whoever performs well might walk away with more than applause. Music is seduction. First up, music. Many concubines were trained in instruments from childhood: zithers, flutes, lutes, even drums. It wasn't just about technical skill. It was about mood. A concubine who could strum the guzheng, and make the emperor feel nostalgic for his youth. Jackpot. A concubine who played a haunting melody that tugged at his heart when he was in a melancholy mood. Even better, but here's the catch, music was dangerous. Too joyful at the wrong time. And you looked insensitive. Too sorrowful when the emperor wanted to celebrate, and you ruined his vibe. And heaven forbid you play better than the emperor's favorite concubine, because jealousy and the harem could turn sweet music into a death sentence. Think about it. Every note was a gamble. Play safe and boring. You're forgettable. Take risks. You might shine or fall. Dance. Grace meets politics. Then there was dance. Concubine dance performances weren't just swaying and smiling. They were elaborate, storytelling spectacles. Women rehearsed for hours to perfect movements that symbolized loyalty, purity, or cosmic harmony. But make no mistake, dancing was political. If your sleeve moved too seductively, you might be accused of being indecent. If your steps were too stiff, you looked unrefined. The emperor's gaze was the prize, but every other concubine's gaze was the trap. And yet dance could save lives. There's a story whispered in palace records about a concubine who was nearly forgotten. Her rank low, her chances slim. One evening, during a festival, she performed a dance so moving that the emperor wept. Overnight, she rose to prominence. One dance changed her fate. But here's the chilling part. The concubines who envied her didn't clap, they applauded. And within a year, she was mysteriously gone. Performance was power, but power painted a target on your back. Poetry and prose. Words as weapons. Poetry. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was a scholar, a patron of the arts. If you wanted his attention, you needed more than eyeliner and silk. You needed words. Concubines wrote poems, copied classics, or recited verses by memory. This wasn't light entertainment. Poetry was subtext. A poem about a lonely moon. Maybe you were hinting at your own isolation. A poem about a blooming flower. Maybe you were flattering the emperor's virility. And if you slipped in a line that resonated with him deeply suddenly, you weren't just another concubine. You were the one who understands my soul. But here's the danger. Poetry was also a trap. Too intellectual, and you embarrassed rivals who couldn't keep up earning their hatred. Too emotional, and the emperor might see you as unstable. And if your metaphors were too clever, someone could twist your words into hidden criticism of the throne. Imagine writing a line about a caged bird longing for freedom. Beautiful, right? But dangerous. Because someone might whisper, is she comparing herself to a prisoner of the emperor? One poem could get you banished. Storytelling in Whitland, then came storytelling. Picture a cozy evening. The emperor leans back, sipping wine, and a concubine is asked to tell a tale. Maybe it's a myth, maybe a folk story, maybe even a funny anecdote. Her voice rises and falls, her gestures painting pictures in the candlelight. If she made him laugh, she won affection. If she made him cry, she won his heart. But here's where it gets dark. Storytelling was also a mirror. Some concubines told subtle allegories, tales of kings betrayed by unfaithful queens, or rulers rewarded for favoring the wise. These weren't innocent bedtime stories. They were loaded messages, ways of planting thoughts in the emperor's mind without saying them outright. Dangerous. Absolutely. But sometimes, a clever story was safer than direct words. The audience of Rivals now. Let's not forget the cruelest part. You weren't just performing for the emperor. You were performing for a roomful of rivals, each one ready to tear you down. Every giggle, every glance, every misplaced gesture could become gossip. Sing too beautifully. She's trying too hard. Dance too gracefully. She's flaunting herself. Tell a story too clever. She's manipulative. It was a lose-lose game, unless you mastered the subtle art of balance. Just enough talent to impress, but not enough to threaten. Just enough charm to stand out, but not enough to become a target. In the palace, mediocrity could be safer than brilliance. Performances as psychological warfare, but here's the twist. Performances weren't always for the emperor at all. Sometimes, there were psychological warfare between concubines. A concubine might sing a song with lyrics about betrayal, while staring at her rival. Another might recite a poem about faded beauty, dithered with a pointed smile, subtle daggers, hidden in melody and verse. This was theater in its purest form, not just entertainment, but coded battle. The exhaustion of being on now. Imagine being one of these women. Every day, you're not just surviving, you're rehearsing your smile, your tone, your talents. You're never off stage. Even in private, someone is watching, a eunuch, a servant, another concubine. The palace was one endless performance. And that performance wasn't optional. If you didn't play the role, you faded into obscurity. And obscurity, in the Forbidden City, was just a slow kind of death. So, performances gave concubines power, but they also hollowed them out. Who were you, really? Were you the woman who danced gracefully, the poet who spoke in riddles, the singer who plucked strings of silk? Or were you just a mask, painted over and over, until the real you disappeared? If performances were about dazzling the emperor's mind, beauty was about ensnaring his eyes. And in the Forbidden City, beauty wasn't just vanity, was survival. A concubine's face wasn't her own. It was a battlefield, a mask, and a weapon, all rolled into one. Let's start with this haunting truth. The emperor's glance could change your life. One flick of his eyes, lingering on your powdered cheek, your painted lips, and suddenly, you were elevated. But if he turned away, you might as well not exist. That's how razor-thin the line was. The ritual of paint every morning, concubines transformed themselves. Not with quick dabs of blush, but with layers of powders and pigments, so meticulous it bordered on ritual. White rice powder dusted across the face to create a porcelain complexion. Rouge made from crushed cinnabarias, actual mercury-painted lips into blossoms. Eyebrows shaved and redrawn in delicate arcs, sometimes shaped like willow leaves or distant mountains. Sounds glamorous. It wasn't. The powders clogged pores. The cinnabar slowly poisoned the body. The constant application stripped skin raw. Beauty here wasn't self-care, was self-destruction, in slow motion. But they endured, because bare skin was unthinkable. A concubine without makeup wasn't seen as natural. She was seen as careless, unworthy. In the palace, your face was your armor, and every morning, you put it on knowing it might kill you. Illusions of youth. Here's the cruel irony. The emperor adored youth. But makeup was designed to fake what time took away. Wrinkles blurred under heavy powders, lips drawn fuller, cheeks painted with delicate color. Concubines used herbal concoctions to lighten their skin, because pale skin screamed status. A tan said, you worked in the fields. A pale glow said, I belong indoors, cherished. But the most terrifying part, beauty was fleeting currency. A concubine could be adored at 20, ignored at 25, and discarded at 30. Makeup could only do so much. And that ticking clock hung over every woman like a blade. Scent as seduction. It wasn't just about the face. Scent mattered to concubines bathed in floral waters. Peony, jasmine. They dabbed oils on wrists, hair, even clothing. The goal, to create an aura. If a concubine left the emperor's chamber, and the sheets still smelled of her perfume, she lingered even after she was gone. But again, danger lurked. Too strong a scent, and it became vulgar. Too faint, and it was forgettable. And let's not forget the rivals' concubines sabotaged perfumes, switched oils, even poisoned beauty creams. Imagine reaching for your rosewater, and instead finding it laced with something that burned your skin. In the harem, vanity tables were war zones, hairstyles and hair politics. Now let's talk hair, because hair was a whole performance of its own. Concubines styled their locks into elaborate buns, secured with golden pins, jade combs, and dangling pearls. Each style had meaning. A high, complex bun showed status and favor. A simple braid might mark a woman still waiting to be noticed. But styling wasn't optional, it was exhausting. Servants spent hours tugging, braiding, pinning, sometimes so tightly that concubines suffered headaches. And those jeweled hairpieces, gorgeous, yes but heavy. Imagine carrying a crown of iron and jewels all day, every day. Beauty came at the cost of pain, and the symbolism mattered. If the emperor ordered a concubine's hair arranged in a particular way, it wasn't just fashion, it was a message. She was his favorite, his ornament, which meant every other woman in the room suddenly hated her. Beauty secrets. And deadly shortcuts, of course. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Some concubines turned to dangerous beauty secrets, lead-based powders to make the skin even whiter, herbal tonics promising eternal youth but laced with toxins, binding waists with silk so tightly it damaged organs, all to appear more delicate. And then there were rumors of even darker methods. Whispered tales said some concubines applied concoctions made from pearls ground into powder, believing it gave them ethereal glow. Others allegedly bathed in special elixirs brewed with animal blood or strange minerals. Did it work? Probably not. Did it kill them faster? Most likely yes. But when survival depended on standing out, risks didn't feel like risks. They felt like necessities. Beauty as theater. Here's the deeper truth. Concubine beauty wasn't about being naturally attractive. It was about embodying an ideal. Every painted face, every powdered cheek was a performance. You weren't showing the emperor you. You were showing him a dream. Were you the innocent flower, with soft lips and wide eyes? Or the mysterious siren, with bold brows and shadowed lids? Your look wasn't just cosmetics, it was strategy. And once you chose a role, you had to maintain it. But the cruelest part, you didn't get to choose. The emperor's tastes dictated everything. If he liked pale skin, every concubine scrambled for lighter powders. If he liked round faces, women patted their cheeks. If he admired slender silhouettes, they starved themselves to fit the mold. Their beauty wasn't their own. It was molded, twisted, and reshaped at his whim. The price of perfection now. Let's pause and imagine the exhaustion. Hours of painting your face, styling your hair, perfecting your scent. And after all that, the emperor might not even look at you. He might walk past your room, spend the night elsewhere, forget your name. All that poison on your skin, all that pain in your scalp, all that perfume in your hair wasted. And tomorrow, you'll do it all over again. Because you can't stop. To stop was to vanish. The harem was full of women who once were beautiful, once were adored, and now lived like ghosts. Their faces faded, their bodies weakened by years of toxic powders. And they sat in quiet rooms, watching younger concubines paint themselves with the same deadly tools, chasing the same fragile dream. If beauty was the battlefield of the face, politics was the battlefield of the soul. Inside the Forbidden City, the emperor wasn't the only power. The women, those painted, perfumed, seemingly delicate concubines, were running silent wars, in the shadows. And make no mistake, this wasn't idle gossip or petty drama. This was survival. Every whispered word, every sidelong glance, every shared cup of tea carried the weight of life and death. Alliances, the web of survival. No concubine could survive alone. The harem was too vast, the rivals too cunning. So alliances formed. Older concubines adopted younger ones, guiding them, protecting them, and in return gaining loyal allies. Friendships were political investments, calculated for advantage. But these alliances weren't forged out of love. They were contracts without signatures. Today's ally could be tomorrow's rival. Still, they mattered. A concubine with allies could spread rumors, suppress scandals, and sometimes even protect herself from the emperor's wrath. Imagine walking into a grand courtyard where 50 women are smiling at each other, their voices soft as silk. Now imagine knowing half those smiles are daggers, and half those words are traps. That's what alliances felt like. The tea testee became a political tool. To share a cup was to show trust, but it was also a risk. Poisoning was rare, but possible, so every sip mattered. Concubines often invited rivals for tea, not out of friendship, but out of strategy, to test loyalty, to gauge intentions, to drop rumors disguised as casual remarks. And in those hushed tea sessions, alliances were cemented or shattered. Betrayals in silk, of course. Betrayal was as common as beauty powder. One day you thought you had a confidant. The next, she whispered your secrets into the ear of a rival. Concubines planted spies in each other's rooms. Maids who reported back on movements. conversations, even facial expressions. If a concubine cried at night, the whole palace might know by morning. If she received an embroidered gift, rivals dissected it for hidden meaning. Privacy didn't exist. Every gesture could be twisted, every word used against you. And when betrayal came, it was rarely obvious. Instead of being shouted in the open, it appeared as a sudden coldness from the emperor, a demotion in rank, a missing invitation to a banquet. Only later would the betrayed woman realize someone close to her had turned. Factions and power. Blocks. The harem wasn't a flat hierarchy, it was political chess. Concubines formed factions, often centered around one powerful woman. For example, the empress, official wife of the emperor, was technically the top woman of the palace. She had authority, resources, and influence. Some concubines allied with her for protection. Others formed camps around high-ranking favorites, the women the emperor adored most. Aligning with them meant sharing in their glow. But choosing a side was dangerous. If your faction fell, you fell with it. Picture it, a silent war raging not with swords, but with silken fans and secret whispers. Who sat next to whom at banquets mattered. Who delivered gifts to which eunuch mattered. Every move was political theater. Espionage. Behind curtains, concubines weren't just pretty faces, they were spies. Information was currency, and they traded it constantly. Some used eunuchs as messengers, slipping coins or favors to gather intelligence. Others bribed servants from rival quarters. One concubine might learn that another was sick. Instead of offering sympathy, she might quietly tell the emperor, "So-and-so isn't looking well. Perhaps her beauty is fading." That tiny whisper could tilt favor away forever. And in extreme cases, concubines even spied on the emperor himself. Imagine keeping a diary of what topics made him smile, what foods he avoided, what moods shifted with which ministers. Knowledge of his temperament became leveraged knowledge that could be weaponized. The psychology of fear, the most chilling part. Nobody knew who to trust. Every ally could be a snake. Every servant might report you. Imagine lying down at night, surrounded by silks and incense, yet feeling utterly unsafe. The palace was golden. Yes, but its walls were wired with paranoia. Concubines learned to speak in layers, words that sounded innocent but carried hidden barbs. Compliments delivered with double meanings. Laughter that hid insults. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. It was psychological warfare, sharpened to an art form. And the emperor, he knew this was happening. Sometimes he encouraged it, letting women compete for his attention because it fed his ego. Other times, he punished them, just to remind them he was the true center of power. When alliances turned deadly, sometimes the political games escalated. There were documented cases of concubines accused of witchcraft using charms, spells, or talismans to gain the emperor's love. Was it real magic? Maybe not. But the accusation alone was enough to ruin a life. Others weren't so subtle. Servants found poisoned food, sabotaged perfumes, shredded gowns. A friend might hand you a beauty cream that burned your skin, destroying your face forever. In a world where beauty equaled survival, that was as lethal as a blade. And when such betrayals were discovered, punishments were brutal. Concubines were demoted, beaten, or banished to cold, lonely quarters where they lived out their days as forgotten shadows. The illusion of sisterhood. Despite all this, there were flashes where fragile of real friendship. Some concubines truly did care for each other, sharing laughter, songs, even secrets. But the system was designed to crush sisterhood. The emperor's favor was too limited, the stakes too high. So even the closest bonds cracked under pressure. The palace was built to turn women against each other. And in that environment, love, whether friendship or romance, was a luxury few could afford. When most people think of concubines, they imagine silks, perfumes, and hushed gossip in gilded rooms. But here's the twist. These women weren't just trapped birds in a golden cage. They were, at times, the invisible hands nudging empires. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace. It was the brain of the empire, and every whisper, every smile, every carefully timed glance from the emperor's side could ripple outward into the provinces, shaping policies, appointments, even wars. The emperor's most dangerous weakness, emperors, were supposed to be stoic, untouchable, like gods in human form. But even gods had hearts. And when an emperor favored one woman too deeply, she became more than a lover. She became his weakness. Ministers noticed. Generals noticed. Suddenly, if you wanted to influence the emperor, the quickest path wasn't through dusty memorials or court debates. It was through the ear of the woman, sharing his pillow. So concubines became political conduits. Ambitious families used them as mouthpieces, planting ideas in their minds. Ministers bribed them with treasures to sway decisions. A single bedtime whisper could topple a career. Dynastic threads. Concubines weren't just women, they were dynastic chess pieces. Families offered their daughters to the palace, not simply for honor, but for leverage. If your daughter bore a son, and that son one day became emperor, your bloodline's power skyrocketed. That's why noble families poured resources into their daughters. They trained them in poetry, etiquette, music hall, weapons for seduction and influence. And once inside, they didn't just serve the emperor. They served as the family's secret ambassador, their lifeline to imperial favor. In short, concubines were political hostages dressed in embroidery. Pillow politics. Here's a brutal truth. Many imperial decisions weren't made in the grand audience hall. They were made on embroidered pillows, whispered in the quiet after passion. Imagine a general's promotion hinging not on his campaigns, but on whether a concubine found his family name appealing. Imagine tax reforms bending not because of economics, but because one woman murmured, "My emperor, the people are suffering." The eunuchs understood this too. That's why they often served as intermediaries, carrying subtle messages between ministers and favored women. Sometimes, the emperor thought he was hearing the wisdom of his beloved. In reality, he was hearing the strategy of an entire faction, funneled through silk lips. The empress versus the favorites. The favorites at the center of it all was the empress, the official wife, crowned and legitimate. She had authority, rituals, and the backing of Confucian law. But favorites, especially beautiful or clever concubines, often eclipsed her in influence. This created friction. On paper, the empress ruled the harem. In reality, a single concubine could bend the emperor's will. And when those two forces clashed, the empire itself shook. Some emperors leaned on their empresses for stability, while others fell under the spell of one captivating woman, showering her with lands, palaces, even political favors. These rivalries weren't just personal. They could redraw the political map of China. The rise and fall of factions take this as a pattern. A concubine gains the emperor's heart. Her family rises in rank. Brothers, cousins, even distant uncles suddenly find themselves promoted. Ministers opposing that faction are pushed aside or worse. Eventually, rivals unite against her, exposing her excesses, accusing her of corruption or witchcraft. The emperor turns cold. The family falls. It was a cycle of meteoric rises and catastrophic collapses. Behind every dynasty's political turbulence, you can trace the faint outline of concubine's hands, guiding or dooming the throne. The whisper that changed history. There are countless legends of concubines who altered history with a single suggestion. Some encouraged emperors toward peace, persuading them not to march into bloody wars. Others fueled paranoia, convincing rulers that loyal ministers were traitors, leading to purges. Think about it. Empires rose and fell, not just because of swords and armies, but because of soft voices in candlelit chambers. That's power hidden, deniable, and yet undeniable. Cultural influence. It wasn't just politics. Concubines influenced culture itself. Their tastes in fashion, poetry, and art often set trends across the empire. If a favored woman adored a particular style of dress or hairpin, suddenly every noble lady in the land imitated it. Concubines were cultural influencers, centuries before Instagram existed. They dictated beauty standards, musical fashions, even religious practices. And because they were so close to the emperor, their preferences often became state-sponsored trends. The danger of overreach but influence was a double-edged sword. If a concubine pushed a fairif, she was seen as meddling too deeply in state affairs. Backlash was swift. Ministers loathed the idea of women steering the empire. They framed such women as schemers, Witches, corrupt temptresses, some concubines, were executed. Others were quietly poisoned. Many more were demoted and lived out bitter lives in shadowy quarters, forgotten by the man they once guided. The palace had one rule above all. Women could whisper, but they could never openly rule. Those who forgot that rule paid the price. Ripples across the world, and here's the big picture. This wasn't just about China. Across history, empires everywhere feared and resented women in proximity to kings. From Cleopatra's influence over Rome to European mistresses whispering in Versailles. The pattern repeats. Men claimed the throne, but women at their side shaped the decisions that ruled millions. In China, though, the scale was staggering. The Forbidden City housed hundreds, sometimes thousands of concubines. Each one represented not just beauty, but a family, a faction, a future. And together, they formed an invisible parliament, one that could alter the course of history with nothing more than a glance and a smile.